Let's drop you into the scene. It's medieval Europe when suddenly people around you start developing massive, pus-filled swellings in their necks and armpits. Within days, they're dead. Dark blotches cover their skin, they're vomiting blood, and the stench of death fills every street. Welcome to the Black Death, and spoiler alert, you're not making it out alive. Between 1347 and 1352, this plague didn't just kill people, it obliterated entire civilizations. We're talking about 30 million dead in Europe alone, with some regions losing 2/3 of their population. In Florence, 100,000 people died in just 4 months. 4 months. That's faster than most modern cities could even count their dead. But here's the thing that'll really mess with your head. Nobody had a clue what was causing it. While you're watching your neighbours drop like flies, the best medical minds of the day are telling you it's because the planets are misaligned or God is angry. The actual cause? A bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats. But that wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years. So let's dive into the nightmare. You wake up one morning feeling perfectly fine. Maybe you've got a bit of a headache, but nothing serious. By afternoon, you're burning with fever. Your lymph nodes, those little things in your neck and armpits, start swelling into painful egg-sized lumps called buboes. These things are agony. They're hot to the touch, and within hours, they're leaking pus and blood. Now you're vomiting constantly, sometimes blood. Diarrhea hits you like a freight train. Your skin starts developing these horrifying dark patches as your blood vessels basically explode from the inside. If you're unlucky enough to get the pneumonic version, your lungs fill with blood and you're coughing up chunks of tissue. The math here is absolutely brutal. If you catch bubonic plague, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of survival. 1 in 5. Those are lottery odds, except you're playing for your life. But if you get septicemic plague, where the bacteria gets directly into your bloodstream, forget it. Medieval mortality rate was 99 to 100%. You might as well start digging your own grave. And the speed of this thing was terrifying. Most people died within 4 to 7 days of showing symptoms. Some didn't even last 3 days. Imagine going from perfectly healthy to dead in less than a week. Your family couldn't even process what was happening before you were gone. The worst part? Medieval medicine was completely useless. Actually, worse than useless, it was actively harmful. The doctors of the day believed in something called the 4 humours. They thought your body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And when these got out of balance, you got sick. So what's their brilliant solution when you're dying of plague? Bloodletting. They'd either cut you open to drain your blood or stick leeches all over your body to suck it out. Because obviously, when you're already dying from a bacterial infection, what you really need is to lose more blood and introduce more potential sources of infection. But wait, it gets worse. Some doctors would try to drain the buboes directly, creating open wounds that just invited more bacteria. Others would make poultices, medical pastes out of herbs, animal fat, and sometimes human excrement. Yes, they were literally rubbing feces on your infected wounds. Then there were the plague doctors with their famous bird masks. These guys looked like something out of a horror movie. Long black robes, leather gloves, and those creepy beaked masks filled with herbs and spices. They thought good smells would cancel out the disease. Spoiler alert, they didn't. These masked figures were often the last thing plague victims saw before dying, which is why people started associating them with death itself. And honestly, most of them weren't even real doctors. They were just volunteers or second-rate physicians who couldn't get work elsewhere. Their main job wasn't curing people, it was counting bodies and recording death tolls. Meanwhile, the living conditions that allowed this plague to spread were absolutely horrific. Medieval cities were basically disease factories. People lived crammed together in tiny spaces, often sharing their homes with livestock. Pigs, chickens, and goats lived right alongside human families, especially during winter. The sanitation was beyond disgusting. Most people used chamber pots or privies that emptied directly into open sewers. These sewers fed into streams and rivers, the same water sources people used for drinking and cooking. London's sewage went straight into the Thames. Paris dumped everything into the Seine. Waste from public latrines flowed through ditches that ran down the middle of streets. When it rained, this sewage would overflow and contaminate everything. The streets were covered in animal dung from horses, donkeys, and farm animals being transported through the city. And the rats, the rats were everywhere. They lived in the walls, in the grain stores, in people's homes. Nobody realised these rats were carrying the fleas that carried the plague. To medieval people, rats were just a fact of life, like having bad teeth or dying in childbirth. Personal hygiene was basically non-existent. Most people never bathed. They thought it was dangerous and could make you sick. Clothes were rarely washed. People wore the same outfit for months at a time. When you combine unwashed bodies, unwashed clothes, and houses full of animal waste, you've created the perfect breeding ground for disease. The diet didn't help either. Most people survived on coarse bread, thin stew, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Malnutrition was widespread, which meant weakened immune systems. When the plague hit, bodies that were already struggling to survive had zero chance of fighting off a bacterial infection. But here's where it gets really terrifying. The plague moved fast. Trade routes that had once brought prosperity to medieval Europe became highways of death. Merchants unknowingly carried infected fleas from city to city, spreading the plague faster than any army could march. A ship would dock in Venice carrying goods from the east, and within weeks, the entire city would be in chaos. The plague didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone was fair game. Even the Pope lost a third of his cardinals. King Alfonso V of Castile died from it. Being wealthy might get you better food and a nicer house, but it couldn't save you from a flea bite. And when the plague hit a community, social order completely collapsed. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about families abandoning their own children when they got sick. Parents would literally flee their homes, leaving infected kids to die alone. Servants abandoned their masters. Priests refused to give last rites because they were too terrified to get close to the dying. Bodies piled up in the streets because there weren't enough people left alive to bury them. Churches ran out of space in their cemeteries, so they started digging massive pits outside city walls and just throwing corpses in by the hundreds. Sometimes they'd sprinkle a layer of dirt between the bodies, but often they didn't even bother with that. The smell was unimaginable. Rotting flesh mixed with human waste, vomit, and the smoke from burning possessions of the dead. People would walk around with flowers pressed to their noses, trying to block out the stench of death that hung over every settlement. Economic systems that had taken centuries to build crumbled in months. Entire guilds of craftsmen died out. Farms were abandoned because everyone who knew how to work them was dead. Trade networks that connected Europe to Asia simply stopped functioning. In some villages, literally everyone died. Travellers would find empty settlements with doors hanging open, tables still set for meals that were never finished, and skeletons sitting where people had collapsed. These ghost towns dotted the European countryside for decades afterward. The psychological damage was just as devastating as the physical toll. Survivors developed what we'd now recognise as severe PTSD. They'd seen their entire world end. Imagine watching 90% of everyone you'd ever known die horrible deaths, and you can't do anything to stop it. Religious faith, which had been the foundation of medieval society, was shattered. People had been taught that if they lived good Christian lives, God would protect them. But the plague killed devout priests and innocent children just as easily as it killed murderers and thieves. Many began to question everything they'd been taught about divine justice. Some turned to extreme religious practices, like the flagellants who would march from town to town, whipping themselves bloody, believing their suffering could appease God's wrath. Others abandoned religion entirely and embraced hedonistic lifestyles, figuring they might as well enjoy themselves before they died. The plague also triggered horrific persecution of minority groups. People needed someone to blame for this catastrophe, and Jewish communities became convenient scapegoats. Entire Jewish populations were massacred across Europe, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil to spread disease. Here's the brutal reality. If you were living in medieval Europe when the Black Death arrived, your survival came down to pure dumb luck. It didn't matter how smart you were, how strong you were, or how carefully you tried to avoid sick people. The plague was everywhere, and medieval society had absolutely no defense against it. You couldn't quarantine effectively because people didn't understand how disease spread. You couldn't treat it because medical knowledge was based on superstition rather than science. You couldn't escape it because it moved through trade routes faster than information could travel. The only people who had any chance were those living in extremely isolated areas, remote monasteries, tiny mountain villages, or islands that had no contact with the outside world. Everyone else was basically playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber. By the time the Black Death finally burned itself out in 1352, it had killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. That's roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. Some regions never recovered. Towns and cities that had thrived for centuries simply ceased to exist. The survivors inherited a fundamentally changed world. Labour shortages gave common people more bargaining power. Old social structures began to crumble. The very idea that God protected the righteous was called into question. But here's the thing that should really terrify you. This wasn't even the worst plague in human history. It was just the most famous one. Medieval Europe experienced regular outbreaks of deadly diseases that we've now largely forgotten. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, influenza, all of these killed millions. The Black Death was simply the perfect storm of medieval ignorance, terrible living conditions, and a pathogen that was perfectly adapted to spread through the interconnected world of 14th century Europe. It showed just how fragile human civilization really was when faced with a microscopic enemy it couldn't see, understand, or fight. So the next time you flip on a light switch, take antibiotics or wash your hands with soap, remember. You're using technologies that would have seemed like absolute magic to someone living through the plague years. Technologies that could have saved those 200 million lives if only they'd existed 700 years sooner. Thanks for watching this dive into one of history's darkest chapters. If you enjoyed learning about humanity's struggle against disease, hit that subscribe button because we've got plenty more nightmare fuel where that came from. Until next time, stay grateful you weren't born in the 14th century.